The modern scripture, A Zen Buddhist Bible, is brought to you by Not a Prophet org, the place on the internet to find spiritual guidance powered by artificial intelligence. A Zen Buddhist Bible, the favorite scriptures of the Zen Buddhism, content, history of early Zen Buddhism, self-realization of noble wisdom, the Diamond Sutra, the Prajna Paramita Sutra, the Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch. Edited, interpreted, and published by Dwight Goddard, Thetford, Vermont, 1932, dedicated to his honored teachers. Daisetsu Teitaro, Suzuki Professor, Atani University, Teiko Yamazaki Roshi, So, Ko, Ku Monastery, Preface. Indian types of ethical and philosophical Buddhism did not easily find acceptance in China. It took centuries of contact before a distinctively Chinese adaptation of Buddhism was effected that proved to be congenial to Chinese soil. This Chinese type of Buddhism is called Xiaqian in China and Zen in Japan, and Zen seems to be the more familiar name for it in America and Europe. Other sects have risen and decreased, but they proved to be more or less exotic. They never became indigenous as did Zen. An exception may be suspected in the case of the Pure Land sects, but it should be remembered that the Pure Land sects developed from Zen and not independently. To tell the story of this adaptation of the Indian type of Buddhism until it became fixed in the teachings of the Sixth Patriarch is the purpose of this book. The main part of the book is given over to English versions of the favorite scriptures of the Zen sect. To this is added historical and literary introductions and a few notes that seem to be called for to make certain phases of the sutras more easily intelligible. Let us recall the fact that the knowledge of Buddhism in America and Europe has all come within 100 years. For 75 years of that time it was presented largely by Christian linguistic scholars who were more or less unconsciously prejudiced against it and who very imperfectly understood its deeper implications. It is only within the last 25 years that books written by competent and sympathetic Buddhist scholars have begun to appear. Moreover, knowledge of Buddhism has come at first through translations of Pali texts, which represent an older and more primitive type of Buddhism. It is only recently that the great Sanskrit texts, revealing the later philosophical and metaphysical riches of the Mahayana type, have been translated and appreciated. Buddhism was represented by the earlier Christian scholars as being atheistic and pessimistic, which a more sympathetic study of the Sanskrit texts has shown to be a misunderstanding and a misrepresentation. Surely an eternal process based on unchanging law and leading to peace of mind and selfless compassion and the self-giving of bodhisattvas and Buddhas, and the undifferentiated love and wisdom, which is Buddhahood and Dharmakaya, is far removed from atheism, and the blissful peace and cessation of change, and the self-realization of noble wisdom have nothing in common with pessimism. But intelligent interest in Buddhism is increasing, and the old-time question, that used to be the only question, what is Buddhism, is giving way to a new question, what type of Buddhism is best adapted to meet modern questions and modern problems? To answer these questions is this book presented. Xiaqian Buddhism in China and Korea and Zen in Japan, for 1,000 years, have been powerful in molding the spiritual, ethical, and cultural life of great nations. Today, when Christianity seems to be slipping, it is the most promising of all the great religions to meet the problems of European civilization, which to thinking people are increasingly foreboding. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on mind, control, its dispassionate rationality, its cheerful industry, not for profit but for service, its simple, hearted love for all animate life, its restraint of desire in all its subtle manifestations, its subjection of desire to wisdom and kindness, its practical and efficient rule of life, its patient acceptance of karma and reincarnation, and its actual foretaste of the blissful peace of nirvana, all mark it out as being competent to meet the problems of this materialistic and acquisitive age. The original texts of these scriptures are very corrupt, disorderly, loaded with accretions, and in places very obscure. The purpose of the present versions is to provide an easier and more inspiring reading. For scholarly, study students are expected to refer to the more precise translations of linguists. The rules that have been followed in preparing these versions are as follows: to omit all matter not bearing directly upon the theme of the sutra, to arrange into a more orderly sequence, to interweave and condense cognate teachings, to interpret obscure words and teachings. The need for this course will be apparent to any earnest-minded person who goes to the scripture for spiritual guidance, inspiration, and comfort. In the sutras, there are certain Sanskrit words that are of great importance to the understanding of the teaching that are difficult to translate in single words. It seems advisable to speak about them at this time. Dharma, law, truth. Specifically, Dharma has come to be used for the Buddha's teaching as a whole, and also as truth in its universal aspect. Dharmakaya, truth, body, truth, principle, truth essence. It is used synonymously with such terms as Buddhahood, Tathagatahood, Nirvana, noble wisdom, universal or divine mind, to refer to ultimate reality as being universal, undifferentiated, harmonious. Inscrutable, Buddha, the perfectly enlightened one, the one who has fully attained the goal of spiritual unification. Tathagata, the one who has thus come. It is used synonymously with Buddha to express the highest personification of reality. The two terms may be differentiated in the sense that Buddha is the ingoing aspect of spiritual attainment, while Tathagata is the fourth going aspect of spiritual self, giving and service, both being manifestations of Dharmakaya. Prajna, the active aspect of Dharmakaya, ultimate principle of unified love and wisdom. It is commonly translated wisdom, but it means far more than that, as it includes both the differentiating principle of intellection and the integrating principle of love. In significance, it resembles the Chinese Tao, Arya Prajna, noble wisdom, synonymous with all other terms denoting ultimate reality. Tathagata Garbha, the womb from which emerge all manifestations and all individuations. It is used synonymously with universal or divine mind. Dharmakaya refers to the universal or pure essence or such-ness of reality, in contrast to the transformations of the Tathagata. Alayavanana, universal or divine mind or all-conserving mind. It is used synonymously with Tathagata Garbha and noble wisdom. Arya Jnana, that which transcends knowledge or transcendental intelligence. It is used synonymously with Arya Prajna, but signifies the realization, aspect of noble wisdom. Bodhi is the wisdom content of Prajna. Karuna is the love or compassion content of Prajna. Jnana is the knowledge or cognition or thinking content of Prajna. Manas, the intuitive mind, the connecting link between universal mind and the individual or conscious or discriminating mind. Manovinana, the conscious, perceiving, discriminating, thinking, intellectual mind. Vejnana, the principle of discrimination, the sense, minds. Siddha, mind in general. Dwight Goddard, Thetford, Vermont, USA, 1932. History of Ch'an Buddhism previous to the times of Hui-neng Lang. The traffic between India and China in very early times was very considerable in spite of the tremendous difficulties and dangers of the passes over the high Himalayas, the Tibetan deserts, and the appalling wastes and tempests of the southern seas. But in spite of the difficulties, intimations of Buddhism began to percolate into China certainly as early as the 1st century before the Christian era, and by the 1st century after eminent Indian scholars were finding it worth their trouble to make the arduous journey for the sake of the welcome and the honor they received at the imperial court and by the literati, so that by the 2nd century Buddhist scriptures were being rapidly translated into Chinese. The Chinese, while being notably intellectual, were not especially philosophical or religiously minded. They were a practical people, and their culture was largely given up to ethics, history, poetry, and art. The exuberant imagery, subtle symbolism, erudite philosophy, and deep psychological insight of the Mahayana Buddhist scriptures came as an intellectual revelation to Chinese scholars and was everywhere received with scholarly enthusiasm. For 500 years this went on with increasing momentum, but with very little adaptation and change to make it more in line with Chinese mentality and racial habits of thought and national customs. To be sure, it had found a certain affinity with Confucian scholarship and ethical idealism, and with Taoist mysticism and naturalistic iconoclasm. All the outstanding Buddhist leaders were Indian-born and educated, and it was an Indian type of Buddhism that was being pressed upon the Chinese converts. It was Indian philosophy that was being studied and Indian ways of meditation that were being practiced. Buddhism was still a foreign cult. It was not until the 4th century that signs of the birth and development of a Chinese type of Buddhism began to be apparent. When Buddhism reached China, it found two main currents of cultural conditions with which it had to contend and make terms, namely, Confucianism and Taoism, neither of which, strictly speaking, were religions. The teachings of Confucius were intellectual, and were almost wholly devoted to inculcating habits of ethical idealism among all classes of people. By its presentation of an ideal, superior man, and its emphasis on propriety and obedience, it appealed principally to the educated and official classes, and tended to conservatism and the perpetuation of ancient customs and intellectual ideas. It was an admirable culture that resulted in a high type of social ethics and customs second to none, even today. It was no mean protagonist for Buddhism to meet, but it had little in common with the rationalistic and disciplinary and selfless ideals of Buddhism. It tended to individual pride of intellect and avarice for position and power, while affecting at the same time ideals of a noble and courteous social structure. Buddhism tended toward mind control, Confucianism tended toward mind culture, Buddhism was revolutionary and iconoclastic, Confucianism was conservative and inert. As we have said, at first Confucianists welcomed the amazing and abounding philosophy and metaphysics and psychology of Indian Buddhism, but later they came to realize that ultimately it would undermine the foundations of Confucianism. In its distrust of Buddhism during the centuries from the 6th to the 9th, it inspired wave after wave of nationalistic persecution. It was not until the 8th and 9th centuries that it came to appreciate the good qualities of Buddhism, and learned not only to tolerate it, but also to accept it as supplying those mystical elements which the human heart craves and which in its own teachings were entirely lacking. The teachings of Taoism, on the other hand, had many things in common with Buddhism. It can be truly said that Lao Tzu, by his doctrines of Tao and Wu, had prepared the way and made ready a welcome for the coming of Buddhism. Nevertheless, there was something in the easygoing fair naturalism of Lao Tzu that was diametrically opposed to the austere restraint and discipline of Buddhism. They both loved the quiet of solitude, but the Taoist sage wanted a little congenial company with whom to play checkers and drink wine and quote poetry, while the Buddhist saint sought real solitude, that he might be less hindered in his strenuous concentration of mind in the attainment of a self-realization of ultimate truth. The doctrines of Tao and Buddha could be harmonized without strain in both their active aspect and their essence of mingled wisdom and beneficence. As the Sanskrit terms of Indian Buddhism slowly gave way to Chinese, the term Tao was freely used for Buddhahood both by itself and in many compounds. In fact, at one time it looked as though the term Tao would almost entirely displace the Sanskrit term of Buddha. If a distinction is made in the meaning content of the two terms, perhaps the term Buddha came to have a more static significance, colored, as it was, by the conception of the Buddha in Samadhi, he with all its realization of blissful peace and equanimity, while Tao always carried a significance of dynamic activity. The words Tao and Buddha are often used almost synonymously, but still there remains a shade of distinction between the active and passive sides of reality. One of the early Ch'an masters said, "Buddha is Tao, Tao is dhyana." The common use of Tao in Buddhist names is also very significant. To illustrate this free use of Tao by the Ch'an masters, let me quote a strictly Buddhist production written by Rinzai, which is much admired even down to today. "It was given to me by my own master, as part of his instruction. Buddha nature is the symbol of purity, Dharma. Mind is the symbol of enlightenment. The Tao is the way of unobstructed truth. In essence, these three are truly one, but by themselves they are merely words. The mind of the Tao. Man should be pure, enlightened and free. Originally, Lao-tzu had a conception of the value of mind, concentration as an intuitive method of arriving at a self-realization of reality. But in Taoism, it had become buried under a burden of self-induced trance and vision and revelation as a guide for the attainment of success and good luck. Nevertheless, there was an underlying similarity or affinity between the conceptions of the value of concentration of mind in both Buddhism and Taoism. When Buddhism came to China, it most decidedly had to make terms with Taoism, for while Confucianism was the cult of the literati, Taoism was the faith of the common people. Taoism was indigenous, and while the teachings of Lao-tzu had been atheistic and sensible, in the course of 1,000 years, Taoism had taken up into itself the crude animism of a great racial inheritance to make it most decidedly spiritistic and superstitious and geomantic. Moreover, there was the Taoist doctrine of Wu-why. Wu-why can be translated non-assertion. In Taoism, it generally carries the meaning of the acceptance of Tao as being infinitely wise and beneficent and powerful, and therefore Taoism emphasizes the futility of interfering with the cosmic currents and the wisdom of falling in with the natural unfoldment of the Tao in both nature and human affairs. To Taoists, the human interference either by force or legislation or culture with the course of nature is looked upon as the height of foolishness. To take things as they are and as they come is the teaching of Taoist wisdom. In one sense, this is what Buddhism, by its doctrine of patient acceptance, teaches, but in another sense, Buddhism is quite opposed to any lazy inertness in meeting the difficulties of life. While Buddhism teaches the patient acceptance of the results of old karma, it also teaches that good karma is to be attained by the disciplined restraint of desire, habits of clear thinking, extinction of egoism, and concentrated meditation, thus making a rational interference with the course of nature which, if yielded to, would result in suffering, the course of wisdom. Another circumstance that tended undoubtedly to the yielding of Buddhism to Taoist influences in these early days was to escape the virulence of the nationalistic persecutions which were fomented by Confucianists and which for 200 years were directed against all forms of Buddhism, as being a foreign religion, prejudicial to the welfare of the state. This persecution was largely escaped as Buddhism became disguised as a form of Taoism, and often it was not so much a disguise as it was the real thing. For instance, in the case of H. Xuantian, who is usually reckoned as a Ch'an Buddhist of a rather extreme type, he is reported to have said to his disciples, "Here there is no Buddha nor Patriarch." Bodhidharma was only an old bearded barbarian, the bodhisattvas are only dung, heap coolies, nirvana and bodhi are dead stumps to tie your donkey to, the 12 divisions of the Tripitaka are only lists of ghosts and sheets of paper fit only to wipe the pus from your skin, and all your 4 merits and 10 stages are mere ghosts lingering in their decaying graves. Can these have anything to do with your salvation? Of course, such words as these must not be taken too literally, for the literature of Ch'an Buddhism abounds with the most extravagant and seemingly foolish remarks of the masters that to be understood and make sense of must be considered intuitively rather than logically. But they all go to show how serious and deep was the reaction between Buddhism and Taoism in those early centuries. At this distance of time, it is hard to realize how difficult was the process toward adjustment between these two cults that had so much that was similar. For a century, it was a question whether the result would be Taoism as modified by Buddhism, or Buddhism modified by Taoism. Most fortunately, it proved to be the latter. Even down today, Taoist temples and Taoist monks are often indistinguishable from Buddhist temples. In 1927, the writer visited a Taoist friend at his hermitage temple just outside of Nanking. It was arranged and decorated precisely like a Buddhist temple, had a Buddhist image of Amida, but when we left, the Taoist monk gave us as a parting gift a copy of Lao-tzu's Tao Te King. In Henry Borell's well-known essays, one dealing with Lao-tzu's philosophy, His Taoist monk gives to his parting guest a beautiful image of Hui-neng, and in the essays themselves it is hard to say whether they are more Taoist or Buddhist. Dr. Hui-neng, the eminent Chinese philosopher and historian, in a tentative and as yet unpublished study of this very subject and period, speaks of this reaction as a revolt of Taoism against Buddhism, while Dr. Daisetsu Suzuki, the equally eminent authority of Zen Buddhism, speaks of it as the natural evolution of Buddhism under Taoist conditions. Of the two, it would seem as though Dr. Suzuki was the nearer right, but in either case the result was the same: the development of a type of Buddhism that was free from the extravagancies of Indian philosophizing and intellectual inertia and sentimental personalizations, and true to the original common-sense practicality of Shakyamuni. By the 4th century, most of the outstanding Mahayana scriptures had been translated into Chinese. Among them were many books about the Indian yoga practices of breathing and other methods for the attainment of mind, control and concentrated meditation that made up the Indian practice of dhyana. The Chinese were a practically minded people and had never cared very much for philosophy and metaphysics. Being intellectual, they were amazed and excited by the elaborate metaphysics and exuberant literature of the Mahayana, but they were more particularly attracted to the practical systems of dhyana that promised tangible results of enlightenment and ecstasy and blissful peace that could be tested and evaluated. It naturally came about, therefore, that the first serious popular acceptance of Buddhism was in the practice of dhyana, and as the most popular subject for meditation and concentration was divine name, with its promise of rebirth in the Pure Land. The later sects that go under that name, on the surface, appear to have a certain claim to priority. But it is a question whether this earliest acceptance can rightly be called a salvation by faith type of Buddhism, for its emphasis on dhyana practice would mark it as a meditation type. Much depends on whether the phrase Namu Mit Tio Fu was used in those early days as a subject for meditation and concentration, or as a mantra with magic working powers. Dr. Suzuki has discussed this question at length in his essays in Zen Buddhism, 2nd series, where it can be studied to advantage. The first name that emerges in this connection is Tao, and minus 385. He was a notable monk, learned in both Confucian and Taoist lore, and books of his are still extant dealing with these yoga practices of dhyana and commenting upon them. It is easy to see from them that he looked upon these Indian practices as good working methods for attaining Taoist ideals of non-activity and non-desire. Taoan left a disciple, Yuan 333-416, who was also a great scholar and learned in Taoist mysticism. He is most remembered as the founder of a Buddhist center or fraternity near Kuling, known as the White Lotus Society, whose characteristic was their concentration on the divine name, in consequence of which he is commonly looked upon as the founder of the Pure Land sects of China and Japan. But history shows that he was more interested in the serious practice of dhyana, and to him the repetition of the divine name was the best method for attaining concentration of mind. There was nothing new in the practice of dhyana. It had existed in India for a millennium, and was taken over by Shakyamuni and given a new content of meaning as the 8th stage of his noble path. As it appeared in China, it was at first largely a practice of Indian yoga methods as an aid to meditation, but it had degenerated into a popular and easygoing sitting, and a lazy habit of thinking, the characteristic that now began to emerge in the teachings and interest of Taoan and Yuan was the more definite focusing of mind and its more energetic character. After Yuan there came into prominence one of his disciples, Tao, Seng minus 434, who with his disciple Tao Yu developed the doctrine of sudden awakening, as against the almost universal belief in the gradual attainment that thereafter entered into Chinese Buddhism to condition its distinctive characteristic. By this teaching, the old conception of the gradual attainment of Buddhahood through myriads of kodis of rebirths was challenged, and in its place was offered, through the right concentration of dhyana, the possibility of sudden and perfect enlightenment. The Chinese Ch'an Buddhism that came to monopolize the religious field was the mingling of these two distinctively Chinese elements, a more strenuous dhyana, and the possibility of a sudden awakening and attainment of enlightenment with the Indian philosophy of the Mahayana. The next outstanding name, and the one to whom is usually given the chief credit for being the founder of Ch'an Buddhism in China, is Bodhidharma. He was an Indian monk of princely family who must have arrived in South China about 470 A.D., and who lived and traveled in China for 50 years until about 520. This length of stay in China is much longer than is usually given, but it appears to be necessary to account for all that is recorded concerning him. He must have been a most extraordinary man, a great personality, stubborn, taciturn, gruff, and positive, but withal honest, straightforward, and clear-minded. There are two incidents in his life that will bear repeating. Emperor Wu of Liang was very favorably inclined toward Buddhism. He founded temples, supported monks, and translated scriptures. But when he asked Bodhidharma during an interview what credit he had earned, the gruff old monk replied, "None whatever, your majesty." To the question, "What is the first principle of the holy doctrine?" Bodhidharma replied, "Vast emptiness, and there is nothing in it to be called holy, sire." "Who is it, then, that confronts me?" asked the emperor. "I do not know, your majesty. There is a famous poem that refers to the above incident, that has for these present times a deep significance. I don't know," replied Bodhidharma, baffled by the classical speech of the imperial court. But if the emperor had been a man of insight and spirit, he would have chased after Bodhidharma over the desert sand to Tine Mu. Bodhidharma, finding in the north no interest in his presentation of Buddhism, returned to the south and shut himself in his own monastery of Shaolin, to which few disciples ever came, and where, tradition says, he practiced for 9 years a kind of concentrative dhyana that came to be called wall-gazing. It consisted in an honest and earnest effort to definitely realize the oneness of one's true Buddha nature with universal Buddhahood by the single method of mind, concentration on mind, descence. To Bodhidharma, books, logical ideas, study, ritual, worship were useless. Only simple but seeking and tireless wall-gazing was sufficient. All distinctions of self and not self, comfort or discomfort, joy or suffering, desire or aversion, success or failure, and mental discrimination of all kinds must be ignored and left behind, in the sole effort to merge oneself with mind descence, which alone is reality, inasmuch as one's own inner conscience is mind descence. Why seek for it elsewhere? This treasure of the heart is the only Buddha there ever was or is or ever will be. There is no Buddha but your own. Thoughts, Buddha is Tao. Tao is dhyana. Dhyana cannot be understood by the definitions of the wise. Dhyana is a man's successful seeing into his own fundamental nature. I have come from India only to teach you that Buddha is thought. I have no interest in monastic rules, nor ascetic practices, nor miraculous powers, nor merely sitting in meditation. In Bodhidharma's distrust of scriptures and intellectual knowledge, he made an exception of the Lankavatara Sutra. The reason for this exception was because that sutra alone taught the doctrine of the self-realization of the oneness of all things in mind, descence. When at last, after 9 years of wall-gazing, he gained one disciple who understood him, Hui. Kaya Bodhidharma gave him certain instruction that could only be transmitted from mind to mind, and gave him his begging bowl and his robe and his copy of the Lankavatara Sutra, which afterward became the insignia of the Patriarchate, thus constituting Hui as the second Patriarch. There is a tradition that Bodhidharma soon after returned to India, but the place and time of his death is unknown. There is no doubt that at first and for a long time the sudden awakening, Ch'an school, was a hard one to attend. It was well over the border of asceticism and self-denial, with no marks of sympathy between master and disciple to make it bearable. But from that hard school rose a succession of great masters and deep experiences, and an extraordinarily virulent social influence. Concerning the teachings of Bodhidharma and the Ch'an sect, Dr. Suzuki quotes the following passage. The master Bodhidharma first stayed in Shaolin Temple for 9 years, and when at last he taught the second Patriarch, it was in this manner. Externally keep yourself away from all relationships, and internally cherish no hankerings in your heart. When your mind becomes like an upright wall, that is, resistant to the entrance of discriminative ideas, you will enter into the path. At first Hui-Kea tried in various ways to explain to himself the reason of mind, only but failed to realize the truth itself. The master would say, "No, no," but would do nothing to explain it or make clear what mind, essence in its undifferentiated no thought state might be. Later on Hui-Kea said to the master, "Now I know how to keep myself away from all relationships." When the master asked him to demonstrate it, Hui-Kea replied, "I know it always in a most convincing manner, but to express it in words that is impossible." Thereupon said the master, "That is the mind, essence itself, that is transmitted by all the Buddhas. Have no doubt about it." The story runs that Hui-Kea, before he was finally successful, had tried again and again to gain Bodhidharma's consent to become his master, even waiting at his gate one cold winter's night while the snow fell to his knees, and was finally successful only when he cut off his right arm to show the earnestness of his desire. Hui-Kea was very learned in the Chinese classics, and also in the common lore of Buddhism. He seems to have come to Bodhidharma at first more to win his approval than with any great expectation of added instruction, but after he had attained his deep experience with Bodhidharma, he made light of his great learning, became very humble-minded, and earnestly sought for perfect enlightenment. After the passing of Bodhidharma, Hui-Kea did not at once assume leadership as the second patriarch, but withdrew to a hermitage in the mountains and lived quite humbly with the lowest classes of society. He did not shun preaching, but tried to do it quietly and inconspicuously. He was finally murdered by an envious master whose disciples Hui-Kea had unintentionally drawn away. The third patriarch was Sengtiasan -606, about whom very little is known. One tradition has it that he suffered from leprosy and therefore retired to a hermitage in the mountains. There is a record of his transmitting the begging bowl and the robe to Tao H. Sin 580-651. Tao H. Sin was also a recluse, and very little is known of him except that he left a composition which has always been highly valued by disciples of Ch'an Buddhism. The fifth patriarch was Hung, Gen 605-675. It is recorded of him that he was a near neighbor or relative of Sengtiasan and came to be with him when quite young. With his assumption of the patriarchate, there was introduced a decided change in the character of the presentation of Ch'an Buddhism. Hitherto the patriarchs had been of a retiring disposition, or else the times had changed, making it possible for the masters to work more publicly and assemble disciples. At any rate, we find Hung, Gen the head of a great establishment with hundreds of disciples and attaining imperial favor. Among the disciples of Hung, Gen were two who afterwards came into great public notice: Hui-neng, whose sutra we shall study in the following chapters, and Shen 8. Sui, who was second only in rank in the great monastery to Hung, Gen. Shen H. Sui was a very learned man and a notable orator and teacher, but he was egoistic and deficient in the insight that marks the true Ch'an master. Hung, Gen was aware of this, and so, when the time came for him to appoint a successor, he passed by Shen H. Sui and appointed Hun-neng. Having failed in securing the coveted rank of sixth patriarch, Shen H. Sui returned to the north from whence he had originally come, and there established a rival school that for a time was very successful, and he came to be highly honored by the emperor. His school differed from that of Hung, Gen, and came to be known as the Gradual Attainment, or Northern School of Ch'an Buddhism, but at his death it was less successful and finally lost standing. This brings us to the main interest of this book, the life and sutra of Hui-neng, the sixth patriarch. But before we do so, it is wise to say a few words about the general character of Ch'an Buddhism as it was in his day, and show how it differed from ordinary run of Buddhism throughout China. As we have already pointed out, Buddhism, as generally held, was of the foreign type, which had been presented by Indian monks and Indian scriptures. It was largely given up to a study of the various scriptures and an easygoing practice of dhyana. It was still a foreign religion, and only slightly affected by its Chinese environment. On the contrary, Ch'an Buddhism was not at all intellectual, was far from being easy, going and had become profoundly influenced by Chinese Taoism and Chinese customs. In closing this introductory chapter, it is well to sum up the characteristics of Ch'an Buddhism as they differed from the orthodox Buddhism of that early period. Negatively, it was more atheistic. Shakyamuni had been more agnostic concerning the nature of reality. Nestorian Christianity was emphatically theistic, while Taoism was decidedly atheistic, looking upon Tao as being ultimate principle rather than personality. Mahayanistic Buddhism, in contact with the great theistic religions of Central Asia, had grown to be more philosophic, looking upon reality in its three phases of essence, principle, and transitory appearances as existing in a state of undifferentiated oneness. In contact with the polytheism of India and the animistic spiritism of Tibet, it had absorbed much of their love for differentiated images and ranks of divinities, but that was for the accommodation of its more ignorant believers than for its elite. Under the influence of Taoism, Ch'anism became at first quite decidedly atheistic and iconoclastic, shading off later on into a more tolerant attitude, but even down to today. Ch'an in China and Zen in Japan make very little of their images, which are used more for decoration than for worship. Deification of Shakyamuni Buddha that marked the Hinayana of Ceylon and Burma is almost entirely absent in Ch'an. In fact, the adoration shown Amitabh, who is much more apparent, and images of Kuan Yin, Manjushri, and Kasyapa are just as frequently seen, while adoration to the image of the founder of each particular temple, and even for the master of the founder, seems to be more sentimentally sincere and earnest. Further, under the influence of Taoism, Ch'an Buddhism had very little use for the sutras that the Buddhism of those early days made so much of, the Lankavatara being the only exception. Ch'anists, intent in their strenuous practice of dhyana, had found a more direct and immediate realization of reality, and therein were satisfied. The same can be said of all the rest of the common paraphernalia of worship. They had no use for ritual or public services or prayer or priests or ranks of dignity or sentimentalism or emotionalism of any kind whatever. Everything had to give way to the one thing of self-realization of oneness. The result of this contact of Indian Buddhism with Taoism, therefore, was to develop in Ch'an a type of Buddhism that was coldly rational, experiential, positive, and iconoclastic, and that led to a life of extreme simplicity, strict discipline, humility, industry, sympathy with all animate life, and to an equitable and cheerful peace of mind. At first, Ch'an Buddhists had no temples of their own, nor organizations of any kind. They were either isolated individuals living a solitary life, or were groups of disciples gathered about a master. This later developed into the calling of Ch'an masters to be the heads of monasteries belonging to other sects, and still later to the acquiring of their own monasteries and temples, with all their vested abbots of high degree and ceremonial ritual and worldly pride. Nevertheless, as of old, the true Ch'an monk is more often to be found in some solitary hermitage, busy and cheerful at his manual work, humble and zealous at his practice of dhyana, intent on the one goal of self-realization of enlightenment, nirvana, and Buddhahood, while Bodhidharma is usually credited with being the founder of Ch'an Buddhism, and rightly so. It was Hui-neng, the Sixth Patriarch, who gave it more definite character and permanent form that time has tested and approved. Ch'an Buddhism seems to have discerned the essentials of Shakyamuni's teachings and spirit better than any other sect, and to have developed their deeper implications more faithfully. This development came through its contact with Chinese Taoism under the lead of Bodhidharma and Hui-neng, making it a virile and wholesome influence for all nations thereafter. Hui-neng yielded to the seduction of the divine name and thereby gained the credit of being the founder of the Pure Land sects with all their glamour of salvation by faith. Ch'ai-597, one of China's greatest philosophic minds, grew up as an earnest Ch'an Buddhist, but yielding to the lure of his profound study of the scriptures became known as the founder of the Ti school of philosophic Buddhism. Shen Shui, the learned master of the very temple where Hui-neng worked as a laborer in the granary, yielded to the lure of egoism and popularity to become the founder of the passing school of gradual attainment. But Hui-neng, more or less illiterate as he was said to be, had the force of personality and insight and common sense to determine the essentials of the Dharma and the humble and patient zeal to work out and to apply them in the wisest way. The outstanding features of Hui-neng's Xiaqian were as follows: 1. Distrust of all scriptures and dogmatic teachings. 2. An inquiring mind and earnest search into the depths of one's own nature. 3. Humble but positive faith in the possibilities of such an inquiring search, in a sudden self-realization of enlightenment, nirvana, and Buddhahood. 4. Loyal and patient acceptance of such self-realization in a following life of simplicity, self-restraint, industry, and sympathy with all animate life. In arriving at these convictions, Hui-neng's inherited and experiential acquaintance with Taoism was very influential. He was said to be illiterate, but this could have been only relatively true of one who had mastered the Diamond Sutra and frequently discoursed to his disciples about the other great sutras of the Mahayana. His study of the Diamond Sutra had convinced him of the truth of emptiness and prepared his mind for the later truth of self-realization, of mind essence, which the Lankavatara taught him. But it was the conception of the Tao, active, limitless, inscrutably wise and benevolent, universal, eternal, ineffable, that gave depth and substance to his convictions and brought sympathy and patience with himself and with all animate life. It was the blending of all these elements in the mind and spirit of Hui-neng, the Sixth Patriarch, that through him gave Chinese Xiaqian and Japanese Zen Buddhism their characteristic form and spirit. Hui-neng was deeply influenced by his inherited and personal acquaintance with Taoism. In his leadership and teachings he made little of the personal Buddha and very much of prajna, in which he saw the ultimate principle of Tao in both its irradiant and integrating forms, as both intellection and compassion. The term he used for ultimate reality, and made so much of, was mind essence. A self-realization of this was all the Buddha he cared about. It was Dharmakaya and Buddhahood and nirvana and tathata and prajna. It was universal, undifferentiated, and inscrutable, but was clouded over and hidden by karma and discriminative thought and desire and grasping. If these clouds could be driven away, and they all might be, then it would shine forth in all its pristine purity and potency. To Hui-neng, perfect enlightenment and self-realization of mind essence and Buddhahood were the same thing. This perfect culmination of life would come suddenly as the result of an earnest and sincere concentration of mind on the search for it within one's own mind. And this was the only way it could come. In his mind all scripture and all teachings were subordinate to the self-realization attained suddenly by earnest dhyana and samadhi, self-realization of noble wisdom, based on Professor Suzuki's translation of the Lankavatara. Professor Suzuki's studies in the Lankavatara Sutra was published in 1929, and his translation of the Lankavatara in 1932, George Routledge and Son, London. The books awakened a great deal of interest in the Lankavatara, which, until these books appeared, had been almost unknown to the European world. They also awakened a great deal of admiration for Professor Suzuki's scholarship and patience in carrying to a conclusion so great a task, and in so scholarly a manner. Owing to the nature of the original Sanskrit text, the English translation is very difficult reading, and Professor Suzuki felt, if the sutra was ever to be read by many general readers, that an editing of it in the interest of easier reading was almost a necessity. For that reason he encouraged the editor to undertake the task, but of course, Professor Suzuki is in no sense to be held responsible for its character or interpretations. Under the general rule adopted by the editor, the long introductory chapter, the Mitidinga chapter, and the chapter on Dharani were omitted entirely as being later accretions and in no direct sense relating to the theme of sutra. The long chapter of verses is also omitted as being obscure and repetitious, and as the essence of the verses is given in the prose sections, they can be omitted without loss for the sake of easier reading. In addition, certain small sections are omitted because of their obscurity, or because they do not appear to add anything to the elucidation of the main thesis. Under the second rule, the sutra was cut up into more or less small sections and rearranged into something like an orderly sequence. Under the third rule, These small sections were interwoven and condensed by omitting repetitions, matter that was obscure or tiresomely argumentative. Under the fourth rule, a minimum amount of interpretation was introduced. This was absolutely necessary if the sutra was to be easily or agreeably read, but the interpretations were confined to matter found within the text itself. Often the author of the sutra would refer to an important doctrine by a single compound word, which, if translated, would be meaningless to modern Occidental ears. In such cases there was nothing else to be done, if the reading was to be easily understood, but to interpret it at more or less length. I have been scrupulously careful not to do any more than was necessary to bring out the full meaning of the text. As readers become interested in the sutra by the reading of this version, they are urged to continue their study of it from the original Sanskrit, or from Prof. Suzuki's books, Introduction, as an extended introduction to the study of Lankavatara Sutra has been given by Prof. Suzuki in both his studies and translation. Only a very brief statement is necessary here. Nothing is known as to its author, the time of its composition, or as to its original form. There is a myth that it originally consisted of 100 verses, and the second chapter of the present text has a footnote which reads, "Here ends the second chapter of the collection of all the dharmas, taken from the Lankavatara of 36,000 verses." Apparently it was originally a collection of verses covering all the main teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. This vast collection of verses became a source from which the masters selected texts for their discourses. As the verses were very epigrammatic, obscure, and disconnected, in the course of time the discourses were remembered and the verses largely forgotten, until in the present text there are remaining only 884 verses. The present text has every appearance of being something in the way of a disciple's notebook, in which he had written down extracts or outlines of his master's discourses on some of these verses. It is generally felt that the present text must have been compiled early in the 1st century, probably a little earlier than the Awakening of Faith by Ashvaghosha, which doctrinally it greatly resembles. The earliest date connected with it is the date of the first Chinese translation made by Dharmaraksha about A.D. 420, and which was lost before 700. 3 other Chinese translations have been made, one by Gunabhadra in 443, one by Bodhidharma in 513, and one by Shikshananda about 700. There is also one Tibetan version. The sutra has always been a favorite with the Ch'an sect Zen in Japan, and has had a great deal to do with that sect's origin and development. There is a tradition that when Bodhidharma handed over his begging bowl and robe to his successor, that he also gave him his copy of the Lankavatara, saying that he needed no other sutra. In the early days of the Ch'an sect the sutra was very much studied, but because of its difficulties and obscurities it gradually dropped out of common use, and has been very much neglected for the past 1,000 years. But during that time many of the great masters have made it a subject of study, and many commentaries have been written upon it. Although other sutras have been more commonly read, none have been more influential in fixing the general doctrines of Mahayana Buddhism, and in bringing about the general adoption of Buddhism in China, Korea, and Japan. In closing, just a paragraph must be given about the characteristic teachings of Lankavatara. It is not written as a philosophical treatise is written to establish a certain system of thought, but was written to elucidate the profoundest experience that comes to the human spirit. It everywhere deprecates dependence upon words and doctrines, and urges upon all the wisdom of making a determined effort to attain this highest experience. Again and again it repeats with variations the refrain, "Mahamati, you and all the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas should avoid the erroneous reasonings of the philosophers and seek this self-realization of noble wisdom." For this reason, Lankavatara is to be classed with the intuitional scriptures of the Orient, rather than with the philosophical literature of the Occident. In China, it combined easily with the accepted belief of Chinese and Lao-tzu's conception of the Tao and its ethical idealism to make the Buddhism of China and Japan eminently austere and practical, rather than philosophical and emotional.